All right, I guess this is the first time we have ambient and workgroup combined. Keith, thank you for updating the ambient meeting minutes, and also jump over there. Was anybody in the other Google Meet?
Yeah, Costa and Arian popped in, but they made it over here. So I also pinned a message in the chat that should stick around even though I left. So hopefully folks who joined will make their way over here.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and get started. Let me see if I can think I'll share my screen. All right. Okay. Okay, so we have a couple of things on today's agenda. I assume we'll go that first and then jump to the agenda for the next meeting under that first. Next, so the first one maybe already finished with the ambient agenda. I think Keith, you already added a note in the meeting minutes. So it's probably sufficient unless you think we need to do anything else.
Yeah, I think that's probably we're probably good here. The way I read the original question was like, should we keep it around? I would suggest keeping it around for perpetuity, just so we've got access to all the context.
Yeah, definitely we need the context. I agree. There's a lot of decisions we made. Sometimes I go back to the meeting minutes myself too. And I think the calendar invite has been removed from what I can tell. So if people subscribe to the calendar, they should be good. All right, let's move to the next topic. Aryan, do we have Aryan here? All right, awesome. Go ahead. You're with Costin, right? Can you take us through this?
Sure. So we have few customers who are using like on-prem. Basically, they're running services on on-prem and they cannot use the Envoy defaults like TLS cipher suites, which is very restrictive. So they're using Envoy filters, which is a pain to manage for them. So the proposal is like, I guess I saw a PR already open for this, but I guess nobody like probably merged this. But is it possible that we can add the TLS cipher suites and the min-max TLS version at least in the destination rule API and the client TLS settings so that these users won't require the Envoy filters anymore? Yep. Any thoughts on this? I know Costin had some issues with this.
Yeah, I mean, my usual comment is that it's an arcane settings that adding it to the API, it's going to make it even more harder to use, and there are so few users that need it that probably to be better as an annotation or some other resource that doesn't interfere with the main, especially since we have Kubernetes gateway API where it needs to be used, and we want destination rule to be kind of, I don't know. I mean, it's a good idea to have the feature, but I'm concerned about the API shape and the interaction with the gateway API.
But it's up to the user, right? If they adopt it or not.
Well, no, it's up to us because we need to maintain it and we need to explain to all the other users who don't know what it is.
So by default, it won't be there. It's like just like for these users, they set it up, then only it will come in effect.
No, we can't just add a bunch of stuff and say it doesn't. That's not how it works. Like the presence of something raises the net complexity of the project, so we need to keep the net complexity down.
Could you go into like, could you provide some background on why this wasn't pursued before? Just like summarize what's in this issue here.
Sure. So right now, users cannot modify the client TLS settings, especially the TLS cipher suites and the min-max TLS version. And like we have some users who want to update the TLS cipher suite. They want to use the older cipher suite, which Envoy by default doesn't support. And they want to connect to the on-prem services, which this TLS cipher suite wanted. So right now, there is no direct way from any of the Istio APIs. Users can use it. What they are doing, they're using Envoy clusters. They're updating the clusters basically in the upstream TLS context, putting these cipher suites, which is kind of hacky way because like this is a real requirement for any user if they want to connect to on-prem, because generally on-prem are way behind like the current Envoy, right? So in my opinion, we should give them like any first class API, probably something in the mesh config we can do, but it's not there yet.
One thing that was discussed in the past, and Louis and others raised it, is that even if we have this API, there is no guarantee that it could be supported, because Envoy could be compiled not to have these ciphers compiled into the binary. So a solution that is basically putting a notation on the code that needs to, or egress gate or whatever is needed that needs to make it out, or a label, is much better, because it allows the injector or whatever else it's there to put a version of Envoy that has the binary cipher that is needed. So if you want to have legacy ciphers, putting an API is not helpful if the Envoy that gets injected is compiled with its compliance and doesn't have the ciphers.
But we already have this in like on the ingress, on the server side, right?
I know, but even ingress is not guaranteed to have it supported. I mean, it's the fact that is if someone is compiling Envoy without the ciphers, which they should, it will be broken. It's not the fact that it's an API doesn't mean the binary will have it. Anyway.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you are up next.
Yeah, so I'm curious about let me ask this question. What is the difference between the server version of, or what is the cost difference between the server side version of these APIs, which I understand already exists, and the client side version of these APIs? Do we feel like there's a significant difference in the cost of maintaining one versus both?
I don't see a difference, honestly. Do you guys see any difference? I think it's the same thing, right? On the ingress, we support that. On the server side, on the client side, it's not there.
I mean, it is, if we want to gateway API, I don't think it's present. So it's only in our API.
Yeah, it's not there yet. Probably it might come in future.
That's the same question. I mean, for the same reason, it may not come.
But Gateway API doesn't have a MTLS API at this point. Like they're still like working on it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I want to weigh in. I mean, based on what I saw on some of the comments, like I think Zhanghu kind of summarized what I think most of the user doesn't want to config ciphers, right? So we already have a configuration knob for the cipher suite ingress. I think what you wanted to champion for, if I understand correctly, is the cipher suite not on the north-south traffic, but on the inter-service communication within the mesh, which I think it's rare. And the other thing I want to us to think about, I mean, Carsten, you touch on the complexity of does the Envoy actually even support the cipher, right? So if we think about in the context of ambient, then I have to think about does cTunnel support the cipher? What about the waypoint? And also if I'm using a pluggable waypoint, all this complexity I have to think about too. So I think we do have a workaround at least user for advanced user who wants to configure cipher, which I definitely think is advanced user, right? At least they can explore with Envoy filter today. John, Carsten.
You raise a very, very good point. I forgot about this, and that's probably even more important with ambient. Destination rule in particular. I mean, Kit asked what is the difference supporting destination rule settings versus gateway settings. And the difference is that gateway is a workload where we can set settings and it impacts that particular workload, while destination rule is kind of a very, very broad, especially since they are per client. They have the cardinalities that each client have the different destination rules, which doesn't work with ambient, by the way. And it impacts pretty much everything in the mesh that is connected to that server. So the impact is it's pretty huge in terms of so it's much more difficult to support anything in destination rules than something in gateway.
I see.
And it will be broken in ambient, as Lynn was saying. So
get it. Like, so the only concern is it's there on the ingress, but it's not there on the egress.
We could deprecate it. I mean, it's not that it's a good thing that, I mean, and again, having something on a listener is different than having it across all clients. Sure. It's asymmetrical.
Yeah, go ahead.
To take what you just said, Carsten, and put it in a different way, if I understand this correctly, I don't think that this is even implementable in ambient period because Ztunnel doesn't read this. And because it's client side, the only clients we have right now are Ztunnels, unless you go through an egress gateway, which would be the only way of enforcing this. So I don't know that this would even be possible to implement in ambient, which our current policy that we're working under is if you can't do an ambient, we don't want to. If it can only be done in sidecars, we don't want to do it. Is that maybe a useful lens to use to look through this?
Yes, I agree. That's a great way to look at this. Thank you.
I see. I get your point. Yeah, that makes sense.
But that doesn't mean it's not. I mean, having a label on the code that needs to make outbound, and making sure that based on the label we inject an envoy that has the ciphers, and we configure automatically the ciphers. That's not necessarily bad. It doesn't impact ambient. That just means that if you have a sidecar you get an envoy version capable of that cipher and configure to use that cipher. Only impacts that workload. It's harmless mostly, and it doesn't break the requirement to not change ambient because again, doesn't have anything to ambient. It's only applying to the sidecar.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But generally, like users who want it on the egress because they want to connect to the on-prem or something. But it's okay, probably at the portal.
Egress gateway. That's also reasonable. I mean, egress gateway is not affected by ambient. It's just a gateway that it's.
Yeah, but even egress doesn't have a client TLS setting all by its own, right? It still uses the destination rule for the client TLS setting.
Yes, that's a problem. It's confusing. That's a problem with destination rule. It's in ambient and sidecars. It's very, very different.
Okay, I'll probably check on this again then. Thanks, guys. We can move to the topic.
All right. Thank you so much for bringing this up for discussion. Jessic?
Yes. Hello. Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you remember that proposal about multi-mesh deployments, as that was written a long time ago by Nathan Mittler, and I wasn't in the project at the time. And the document doesn't include any conclusion why it wasn't implemented. And since we are investigating multi-mesh deployments, I am interested if resurrecting this kind of this proposal or its assumptions, if that makes sense, if this is the direction. And do you remember why it wasn't implemented? Go ahead, John.
I can't say that I actually remember this proposal because I think it's 6 years old now. But I will say that in my mind, multi-mesh is this thing that you ask 10 different people what it means and you'll get 12 different answers. And Istio can do 11 out of the 12 of them. So I view our role as providing tenancy building blocks, not like a solution, because literally I've never heard anyone want the same thing when they say they want multi-mesh or multi-tenant. It's always some different boundaries. So I didn't even read through I skimmed it, but I think it was like proposing an opinionated version. I think that doesn't make sense, but I think maybe missing a few tiny things. Like you can build topologies like this today. We have a lot of things that have been added since then. Like for example, you can have per trust domain root certs, multiple root certs, some other things. I don't know all the things you might need. I don't know what you're trying to build, of course, but you might find a lot of the pieces have been added piecemeal rather than as one whole productized thing.
Yeah, I know that it's possible, and it requires a lot of manual configuration, and this is why I was wondering if this could be ever supported in Istio, and if we can work on reviewing this and bringing it again to the agenda to discuss the scope and requirements and maybe find common understanding of mesh federation or multi-mesh deployment.
I completely agree with John. We have most of the building blocks, probably all, and I looked at this quite a bit in the past, and I think we have all of them. But if you find a missing piece that prevents us as a building block, like ability to configure, destination rule or what SUN to expect, what LPN to send, what trust domain to check, what root certificate to check. So if anything is missing, I think it's very reasonable to add it as a first class building block. But as an opinionated solution, I think it's since nobody knows what it means and everyone has a different opinion, we should rely on building blocks, not on opinionated solutions.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much for your feedback. We can go to the next one.
Okay, so I think basic action for you is if you find out any missing blocks that you need, maybe you can come back in a future meeting and present that.
Yeah, of course. Understand. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. John, you're up next for Gateway API. Oh, Stephen.
Oh, sorry, quickly interrupting. Could either John or Clausen maybe talk a little bit about like what are the 12 different things people mean, just out of curiosity, like how do different people view multi-cluster?
Sure. I don't know. I'm going to get to whole 12. I'm not exaggerated, but it's often like, so the people talked about like tenancy. There's a lot of questions like, do these tenants have a shared root of trust or do they not? Are they reachable at all or through a gateway or directly or allow listed or deny listed? What's that look like?
Is the same cluster?
Same cluster, same network? Do they have shared trust domain, shared root?
How much they trust each other?
What day of the week it is? No. There's quite a few. Does configuration apply to across tenants or is it isolated? All sorts of things.
Makes sense. Thank you.
All right, John.
So I wanted to bring up this proposal in Gateway API for a few reasons. One, for awareness, but also so that we can maybe get feedback on the proposal as kind of as a project rather than me as one person. And partially so that I don't accidentally give the intent that I'm speaking on behalf of the whole project when I'm putting my strong opinions. So I'll give some background, but there's a million comments on there to read, but I can just give a high-level overview. There's actually two proposals that are being unfortunately mixed into one issue. The overall idea here is that today in the Gateway API, they have experimental CRDs, which are like a superset of the standard ones. And this basically just gives you access to more fields in the CRDs for fields that aren't yet stabilized. The goal of the proposal is to make these more isolated for a variety of reasons, namely so that like a cloud provider could install stable CRDs on their cluster by default and not worry about experimental stuff. So the initial proposal, which I don't have a big problem with, is that before an API itself is promoted to stable, it will be in a different group, and then it'll move groups when it goes to stable. We can talk about that if we want, but to me, it's more straightforward and not super controversial.
And
the other issue, though,
wrote here, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
that's Rob's proposal, and then there's a planned follow-up supported by Rob as well, but just not happens to be in this Rob's issue that's being discussed in the specific comment I linked from Shane, which is about extending this not just to new types and a temporary state while those types don't have a stable variant, but actually having a copy of every single API in Gateway for experimental. And so this would be like X gateway, X HTTP route, X backend TLS policy. And this is kind of a mirror ecosystem of Gateway API where there's no interaction between, you can't have an HTTP route attached to an X gateway. You have to have an X HTTP route attached to an X gateway. So that's a general proposal. I guess I'll pause there because it's kind of complex. And we can discuss kind of what I want to get out of this personally.
Yeah, so John, if I understood correctly, the fundamental reason they're trying to solve this problem is they don't want user maybe using resources and then find out the cluster that has the CRD on the wrong level, right? So let's say user might be using an experimental feature, but the the cluster maybe is maybe more unstable or beta without the experimental feature. Is that what's the problem they're trying to solve? Before
I think like if you put your hat on as like say you're a cloud provider, right? You want to maybe install gateway API CRDs by default because your users use them, and maybe you have an implementation of it and whatnot. But you can't really like install things on people's clusters that you can't support and are API compatible and stable and whatnot. So they can install stable, but they can't really install experimental. And these two are slightly mixed in the API today, which causes problems for those Kubernetes platforms. I guess technically it's not just cloud providers. Any like a K3S or something could have the same issue, I suppose.
Got you, because they could bring in their resources and find out it's working, but the resource passed the validation, and because there's no differentiation in the API group. So what
Yep.
Shane is proposing, I think it's very, very bad UX, if I understood correctly, because as the experimental graduate to the next phase, you literally have to remove that X gateway to gateway. So there's not only user have to change the API group, they also have to change the type. So we're asking user to do more things than necessary.
Let's look at the other side of the coin, though. I mean, what we are doing today is we are telling users in production, you should use some experimental stuff. And that's, I mean, I support the proposals by both of them. I put, but not for the reasons that are in the title. So I think having a clear separation and stable APIs and production where only V1 APIs are used is very important. So if you use X gateway, you can keep using X gateway as a stable API. There is nothing in there that say you must move. But it's a clear distinction between experimental, where you have V1 alpha 1 like we had, and we tell people, hey, you are in production, just enable this V1 alpha 1, use V1 alpha 1, experiment, maybe it will work, maybe it will not work. And then when we did V1, we kind of had to use whatever experimental was there because it was impossible to change since people were using it in production. With this problem, this goes away because you can have X gateway, it doesn't pan out, you can keep it there, but real gateway will have a different field or will have a better UX. And users will never have to use alpha in production. That's my take, and I think it will be very useful, and it's like the previous discussion, it's already there because any vendor can already create V1 APIs with whatever they want, and it will work. Anyway, John, or
Keith is up next.
Yeah, so just a couple of clarifications, and because I've been following this similar to John for a little while. Users don't have to use Alpha APIs today. Like there's nothing forcing you to use the experimental channel. If you use the standard channel, you only get standard CRDs. My concern with, I think, both of these proposals is that we trade one set of problems for another set of problems. We trade the user experience problem to Coxon's point. It's easier for user to distinguish sort of which version they're using. We trade that problem for a coexistence problem. Before, you don't have to, as implementation, so as Istio as a controller, you don't have to think about X gateway and gateway. You just have a set of resources, you target experimental, and if this field is unset, you're good to go. In this world where you've got sort of a mirror dimension, I'll start with Rob's proposal. With just a different group, it's trickier, I think, but probably doable if we did some schema shenanigans to map fields, to map groups differently and to interpret things. But with Shane's proposal, that just feels like that's a nightmare. Like having been through the gateway conversion code, like I just envision if statements littered across the code base to check if you're a gateway or X gateway. And then different code paths for, okay, if you're an X gateway and you have this experimental field, you can use this feature. Like as an implementation, I don't know why I would ever want to support the experimental channel. I do think that probably is maybe a net benefit to users. If you want to live on the edge, you do that. If you want to use your cloud provider's standard API distribution, you can do that. But I can't reconcile that with what an implementation would have to do to make that work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Keith, one thing on Rob's proposal that I've been pushing for, TBD how strongly we can get it worded, is that an implementation should never support both. And like the version, like at no point in the gateway API will there be both. It goes from like, let's say backend TLS policy. It's under the X group. In the next version, they move it, they don't copy it, move to stable. And then the expectation would be that an implementation drops their support for X and moves it to standard, which is a breaking change, but it was experimental. Now, I did put on there like, hey, we need to be worried that someone's going to be like, oh, we're going to be better than other people and support both. And then there's going to be an arms race of dual support for both of them. And then we're back at square one. But it's at least plausible for that one to have a sane outcome, I think. That's why I'm not as worried about that one. I have even more concerns than you shared about Shane's proposal, though. So,
okay, that helps. Okay, I'll let you give your concerns. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what you said. So I think like basically what has been done is we've looked at this problem of that like standard and experimental are too coupled. And basically said we're going to throw experimental off the cliff, and it's basically impossible to implement and impossible to use. So I don't know why we even bother doing it. Like I cannot even imagine implementing this in Istio. Like the complexity and risk to standard users is just astronomical, and the pain to users is terrible as well. I think you mentioned it's maybe not so bad, but like consider this: I want to go try out an experimental field, right? I have say 100 routes and 10 gateways. And a bunch of policies. I have to go move all those over to X. Now, I have to go get every Helm chart that was deploying these to support X. I have to get every controller that's using these to support X. So cert manager, external DNS, Knative, all these things, they need to support experimental. And then now I have like 2 copies of these things. I need to keep track of them, make sure I don't like create standard ones when I meant experimental ones. Like it's this insane headache. And it's pervasive across the ecosystem because they're totally separate things. Whereas today, like worst case scenario, if I use an experimental field, some tool doesn't understand it. But like, let's say I add some crap to like a random field in, I don't know, gateway. External DNS just is going to ignore that field and work entirely fine. But we're like kind of splitting the ecosystem. And I don't even see how we could support this. Like you talked about like all these if statements. The proposal is different Go structs for each experimental and standard type entirely. So there's like no way to have like, it's just like, do we just copy and paste the entire code base? Like it's crazy.
Yeah, you have to do like a type assertion for every single piece where you've got logic around the gateway resources. I mean, wow.
I slightly disagree, and that's one way to approach it, and I agree it's a bad way to approach it, but that's not the only way to approach it. If you treat it as just like we treat virtual service and destination rule and our gateway, which is, what's the difference between Istio gateway and the X gateway? It's a resource which has V1. We load it, we treat it as a resource, we merge it with the other, we do exactly the same code for X gateways that we use for Istio gateway. I don't know why it's incremental. It's so much more difficult.
We have conversion logic.
Yes. For X gateway, you can have the same conversion logic.
Sure, but again, to John's point, now you're changing that conversion logic, you're duplicating that conversion logic completely, and you have to still, if John's proposal with Rob gets implemented for same proposal 2, where you only support one or the other, like at install time, that it might be okay, but I'm not a fan of like duplicating everything just for the sake of supporting new fields and stuff. That just doesn't feel worth it.
But we do it already for virtual service. We do it for gateway. I mean, I'm not saying to do what they are saying. I mean, to support one or the other, or to do. I mean, I'm saying just treat it just like a virtual service. It's another resource that we convert internally. Just one class, one struct that converts from one to another. That's how HTTP route is implemented in the first place.
That violates the proposal, Constant, because actually an X gateway can't talk to an HTTP route. They're walled gardens.
So, John, I'm not saying that I agree with everything in the proposal. I mean, that we need to implement it exactly as they say. I mean, we have the choice to implement it however we see fit. The point is there will be an X gateway that we can implement it like Istio gateway. That works.
Sure.
Implement it, that bad for them. We have a good user experience.
There are ways to implement a proposal that involves putting gateway under a different type, for sure. My concern is that this proposal is basically saying, well, we're going to kill the users and we're going to kill the implementations. And in return, like, I just don't even get what we're doing. Like, we might as well just not do experimental. And I propose that in Istio, we just ignore this and say, look, we're not participating in this. If you want to do it, fine. We'll ignore the resources, as will Knative, as will Cert Manager, because it's absurd and impossible to use. But I would just pitch that we delete experimental entirely from the project. At this point is what I.
No, I agree. I actually agree with that. I mean, no experimental, but we can ignore half of the proposal or 90% of the proposal, but keep the 10% that is good.
What's the 10% that's good?
That you have some resources that are clearly separated from, that are stable and clearly separated from the experimental.
Do you name it a different type?
Yeah, it's like V1 gateway. It's exactly what the proposal is basically is to have something similar to V1 Istio gateway, which is the longer we users use it, we can add features, we can do whatever we want, and it is stable. So users are not affected by any change. They can use it in parallel. It's exactly legitimizing what we are doing with virtual service and gateway.
But we never ask user to call it like X virtual service or X gateway. I feel like that's throw the complexity onto the user.
Oh, we tell them to use Istio.gateway instead of X gateway and what V1 alpha 1, V1 alpha 3, V1 beta 1, or V1. There are 4 different names for the same thing. X doesn't change much. In any case, I think we're in agreement that the experimental stuff and some of the parts are implementation suggestions are bad. But my point is that we are already doing this for our resources.
Yeah, but ours actually have a reason, which is that we're trying to move off of the legacy API. This is just creating work for the sake of, I don't know,
of protecting
not
users.
good motivations. Well, we can just protect them by not doing. It's not protecting users if you make something impossible to use, right?
Well, no. I mean, Istio gateway is so we are protecting ourselves by not having experiments, because that's another way to kind of avoid polluting our API, like the previous discussion with adding destination with some extra fields. If it goes to a separate resource, we don't have to have the main resource.
Oh yeah, no, I get that. I don't believe for a second that a single user is going to use this. Like, this is worse than alpha APIs in Kubernetes from a usability standpoint. So
it's by definition bounded. Like, I think that's true. Like, it's by definition you can only use it in a bounded fashion and not for an extended period of time without creating more pain for yourself.
So forget about bounding. That part is bad. I agree. But I'm saying if you have an X gateway and you ignore the bounding, you just use it like Istio gateway. What would be the problem long term for a user, or short term, or anything?
Well, one, they're going to make breaking API changes to it in every few minutes, and two, everything in the ecosystem has to adopt to it. All your controllers, all your tooling, all your integrations, all your Helm charts, everything.
Do they have to adopt Istio gateway?
They have to adopt some implementation, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that's the whole point of the gateway API, right? Was that we're all standardizing on a single API. Now we're saying, actually, you know what? Let's create a new API and break all the standardization.
No. So we have a common set of API, a core that is shared, least common denominator. And then we have vendor extensions, which are well established and including
Yeah,
our
but
APIs.
it's not an extension though, it's a replacement, right? Like X gateway is not an extension of gateway. It's replacing it.
Replacing is wrong. No, I'm saying that X gateway has a way to compose with gateway.
What you're saying, I actually agree with entirely, but that's not in any way what the proposal is saying. We can pitch that. It doesn't. I don't think it solves the problems they exactly want to solve. It solves other problems, but.
And it's well tested. We already do it for so many years. I mean, it's nothing that is not proven by Istio already.
Oh yeah. No, I have no problem with adding new policies that are experimental. My concern, like Rob's initial proposal, is basically saying that, and that I have no problem with. I only have a problem with Shane's proposal, where we're duplicating all the APIs and we have this mirrored universe.
Let's treat it as a suggestion for implementations what to do, and we can ignore it just like we ignore other things. And if other implementation choose to do that, bad for them. I mean, it's not.
Yeah, and that's actually what I want the conclusion of this to be, is that we as a community, not just we as me, go and say, as Istio project, we don't agree with this proposal, and if it's moves forward, we will not implement experimental.
With the part where it's segregated, and we are not going to implement the segregation. Doesn't mean we are not.
The Rob's part with like policies and stuff. That's good.
Okay, we're on the same page.
All right. Well, let's make sure that we have. Okay, so John and I tossing. Anyone else have opinions, disagreements, agreements?
I need to read through the thread and just get more context. I haven't taken a look at this in a long time. My initial thoughts are similar to yours and Cofton's, that this is just not good for the ecosystem and not tenable.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I'm not a big fan of X type, when the user use it, and we use a lot of reference in Kubernetes Gateway API, backend ref, target ref, extension ref. I think it can be really, really complex with introduce X type for some of these.
I joined a little bit later, but just to clarify, are you saying that you're in line with the initial proposal, Bill?
Yeah, the initial is what Rob has. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I am. I don't know that we got broader consensus, with the caveat that we should encourage only supporting one at a time. But Rob knows that, is my opinion.
Yeah, and also I think this model is what Istio used, right? When we first introduce everything, it always starts with like the lowest channel, experimental alpha, and then you gradually move up. So it's
it's not quite the same, Lynn. It's slightly different because what we did was keep the same API, which it's kind of just us saying arbitrarily that's experimental. This is saying it's a completely different API. So like as a user, like you need to go move to the new API. There may be breaking changes to it. It's subtly different.
So we kind of always support all the API group, but for this, I think you have to move to the right API group. Is that what you're saying?
We supported it by not changing it, basically. So we supported multiple versions by having a single version practically, because it's almost impossible with the Kubernetes versioning to have differences.
But quick question, but you mentioned, John, that supporting only one at a time. So I'm wondering how much would it help? So assuming we get a new API there, assuming it graduates, but then I think one of the purpose for a new API group was also to experiment with, let's say you want to add a new field to the API or something. So then
so today we already have an existing mechanism to add unstable fields to stable APIs, right?
Yes, but this is painful.
That's if we just do Rob's proposal, that's what we would continue using. It's just if we go and do Shane's proposal, then that gets broken. Right?
Yeah, I'm not talking about change proposal, but I'm saying like you mentioned that for Rob's proposal, like we're good with it, but only with supporting one at a time. So I think the way we're doing now with unstable fields to the API is not great, and that's why like some of the cases
No,
for this,
one
this
at a
issue.
time means one version. So we are not going to support multiple versions of the same API. So there is you have a particular experimental API, particular CRD. We support it exactly in one form. You cannot have V1 and V2 of the same API at the same time.
Oh,
Which is
okay,
what
but we
did.
would be able to support like the experimental group of policy X and the non-experimental groups of policy X.
Yeah, we can support any subset of the CRDs defined in the X Kubernetes. So each of them, each individual CRD at one point in time can be supported and merged, and we can treat it as a stable API in the sense that it's exactly like we treat V1 Alpha 1 virtual service. Which also means that playing with fields, experimenting with renaming fields is not something that we are going to support, because we know that any rename is going to break users, and it's not something we want to deal with migration. So experiment wherever you want, not in APIs, basically. That's kind of the...
I guess my question is, I like to clarify. My question is, would Istio support experimental policy X and non-experimental policy X, which is a separate API group, at the same time?
I think so. I mean,
That's what John's saying. Okay.
Sorry, John. Experimental policy in XNet, and if ever that particular policy, yes, that particular CRT becomes a core API with V1 in gateway,
Yeah,
with different fields, or it will be a different API basically, which does the same thing. And the Istio holds the virtual service or whatever API we have. So we can have three CRDs doing about the same thing.
yeah, but that is one thing you could do for sure. In the API though, what I'm proposing is that we treat. So why would you do what you said? The reason you would do it is for backwards compatibility for users using the experimental, right? And one thing to clarify, in the gateway API, at least in the current proposal, once it moves to stable, it's moved. It's no longer in X. There is no longer that type. So the only reason it's backwards compatibility, and it's backwards compatibility at a fairly high cost to us, in favor of supporting backwards compatibility for an experimental API, and users shouldn't have expectations of backwards compatibility for experimental APIs. So that's why I was thinking that we just drop X support once stable, because it's experimental, right?
I want to revisit this with Rob, because I think, assuming like, let's say this API has graduated or something, and then it is dropped, as you're mentioning right now, I just think like for future extensions and stuff like that, I mean, we're going to get to the same problem where we have like similar problems what we have today with the experimental API fields. And I know it's also addressing other problems, but yeah.
We have a very, very, very long tradition of breaking users incompatible changes. I think we need to learn the lesson from what we did so far and drop experimental completely, as John was saying earlier. And it's perfectly fine to have APIs that are stable for users. It is not okay to have APIs that go away, because that will be pain for our users and every vendor and every kind of... all of us know how much pain it is to move to ambience, to move from one API to another, to deal with field changes and other stuff. It's not good for us, not good for user, not good for anyone. Leave others to experiment, but we can have non-experimental APIs that we support long term, as long as the users exist. And if they move, a similar API becomes standard, we'll support it in parallel. I want to drop experimental. So thinking about experimental. Experiments are for other things, not for things that users should use.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, Austin, but I think the problem that why we keep subtly disagreeing is because your proposals aren't aligning with what Rob's proposing. So like, I actually agree with your proposals, but like, if in the context that a type is added to experimental, everything I just said previously is how I think we should handle it. Should there even be experimental types? Like, that's versus extended types, like those are different things.
I want to back up a little bit here and ask probably a dumb question. First of all, I think it's easy to fall into the trap where you think of our users as being monolithic. Just, yes, there's a population, a subset, probably a large subset of users who want to be able to, who prioritize being able to have their stuff be stable and standard and not really change a lot and not break them. Completely agree with that. However, one of my concerns with the proposal and also the conversation we're having here is that we are forgetting, in my opinion, we're forgetting about the population of users who needs to move quickly, who needs to, be able to get this feature so they can develop, so that they can do something for their business. I think that is also a very valid population of user. Go ahead, Costa.
I think that you have a very, very good point. They are very important. What I'm saying is that they should be able, if we have a brand new feature that is doing Cypher, whatever it is doing something brand new, they should be able to use it. But we should not treat them as 1 month later they'll need to change. Or we should say, hey, we launched this new feature. It's brand new. You can use it. We are committed to keep it stable. Just like we are committed we have committed and we've kept stable all the V1 Alpha 1 from the earliest Istio. So if you commit to an Istio API that we implement, you know that API will be there for 5 years, even if new APIs exist, and we have the history of doing it for all the old APIs because they all can be traced from Istio V1.
That's certainly an option. I think the other part of in reading through the thread, the GitHub discussion on Gateway API, I'm looking at Nick's pros and cons as far as doing nothing, and I look at that to try to kind of understand the current state. The first con is that it's impossible to guarantee there's a safe path from experimental to standard. My probably dumb question is, how does splitting and having 2 sets of APIs give you a safe path?
It's not so much that there's a safe path, I think, in the sense that, like, as a user, I can go from A to B with, like, no breaking changes or whatnot.
I think it's a safer path and this is why I think it's a safer path because you have a different API. Now you want to move to the new API. You're not just changing a channel and the implementation is managing for you. You're just literally gonna go and create your different API, which is the standard one. So you're likely to less being break. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure what's the current state of, like, let's say Istio users, right, using the experimental channel, and then someone want to move to the standard channel. What are they even doing today? I'm unclear about that. But apparently it's a very hard problem to upgrade. Yeah.
Right. That's my fundamental question. Right. That is the problem that, because we're talking about a class of problems still, I think, is the problem that we're solving with this proposal the fact that it's possible, easy, encouraged, insert word here. Is it too easy to get into a broken state because you just install you install experimental CRDs, then you move to standard CRDs and things break? Is it too easy to do that? Is that the problem?
I think today you don't even have a way to. So let me also back up. Like, I think today you don't even have, because it's the same API, so you don't have a way to have experimental one and non-experimental one the same thing. So, and it's a kind of. Sorry.
If we do what Shane is proposing, how would implementations even be able to provide you that possibility?
Right. I'm not clear about what Shane is proposing because I didn't read it. But, like, if I want to back to what Rob's proposing is, like, and just in general, right? Like, let's go back about it, like, to talk about the problems. So we do want experimental to be a thing, right? Because then implementations implement some things and users want to do, like, and we need feedback, but then people are not able to move. Sorry.
I don't agree. We want experimental. We want what you call experimental. I call stable APIs that are not part of the standard. So let's not call it experimental. If you don't call it experimental, you call new features. We want shiny new features that people can use.
We want to be able to break things. I think that's the concern. We want to be able to break things if we need to. That's the problem statement.
Kit, you said earlier people want to use new feature. I agree with you. I haven't seen any user who want to be broken. if you meet a user who wants to say, hey, I want my production or my environment to be broken, I'll be happy to talk with
So-
them.
Since we have 4 minutes, I want to ask one question. Like, John, how's today? I mean, do you have any experience from users like that started with experimental channel with Gateway API and moved to standard?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, we
Do
don't
more-
really have that level of insight, but it's
Exactly. And if
also, I
tomorrow
don't think
someone,
people feel compelled to move to standard.
I see. And if tomorrow someone is asking this question in Slack, what would be the recommendation for them to do so?
Good luck.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
have
I
opinion.
like
think,
that's not that like it's a flippant answer, but like I just don't really I don't really care that much. I mean, someone should if that's something the user wants to do, they should find a way, and we can always improve the documentation Gateway API. But this proposal doesn't really make it easier to move it either.
That's
and-
exactly my point. That's my only
when you say
point.
this, you mean change proposal, right?
Either one.
No, I think if you have different groups, it is easier because this group. I mean, you could say that, like,
It's not so
these
much that
groups
it's
are
easier; it's that you're forced to, right? It's that at some point you upgrade, and the experimental one's been ripped out from under you. So
So
no, but
is it fair to say
assuming we're changing it to not being ripped out from under you, then you could spin up an experimental group. Let's say policy X. You're using this policy, whatever you want. But then the moment you want to move to standard because because I don't know, your company requires standard, or you just move because to test some features, you want to go back to standard, to spin up the new standard policy with the right fields. And ideally, you're not breaking anything, right? Because your controller reconciled them both and is able to understand. I mean, we could have semantics about this being the same name or whatever, but like, it's just being able to have both API groups gives you a whole lot of flexibility you don't have with just channel, that it's the same API group. It cannot coexist in the same cluster. Like, if we were to say to Istio users, hey, you cannot have virtual service and HP route in the same, like how would people actually migrate to HP routes? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, yeah, I just personal opinion, but yeah, I think it requires a little bit more thinking here. I did have another question. I saw the ambient meeting is moved to the main one, but would that mean that next week it's going to be 9 a.m. Pacific instead of 10?
Oh, are you in Europe time zone? We were thinking just have a meeting at this time.
No, I'm Pacific time zone. I'm asking like.
Okay,
Yeah.
got you. I think he's, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we decided to just always have it like a 1 p.m. Eastern every week. I believe that's what's on the calendar.
That was the decision. The other change to help relieve pressure from this meeting is to make the TOC meeting bi-weekly instead of monthly.
Oh.
So now we'll have just this 1 hour block every week, and then every 2 weeks we'll have a TOC meeting, which I think will help get things like design docs approved, API decisions approved, and just conversation about those sort of things done faster. And that will allow us to sort of have just one meeting each week on Wednesdays versus 2 hour blocks.
Sorry, to conclude. To finish the previous discussion, John, are you going to summarize what we discussed and put it on the? I think we're in agreement mostly about at least the critical part of what is proposed doesn't work.
Yeah, I can put basically that, unless we want to wait for more people to chime in. If not, I mean, we got to.
If we can avoid the word experimental in your summary, I'll be very happy. But I agree with the rest. I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good for you to take a stab, John. Represent the community. All right. I think we're right on time. So sorry, there's a couple of topics we didn't have chance to get to. Maybe we'll continue next week. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.